Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Hello, everybody. Hi, good evening. Welcome to the Museum of Natural Sciences. Yeah, thanks for that. Welcome to the museum. Welcome to the Science Cafe here at the Museum of Natural Sciences in downtown Raleigh. You heard it. My name's Chris. I'm your host for the evening. Raise your hand if this is your first Science Cafe. I want to know who's here for the first time. Give them a round of applause. Make them feel welcome. I love it when we get newcomers. Now, raise your hand if this is your second or more Science Cafe. Give those people, second or more, give those people a round of applause too. Because I'm so glad that you came out to the Science Cafe this Thursday night as well. So are you having a good evening so far? Who's ready for the holidays? Nobody! That's why you're here at the Science Cafe, because you are procrastinating. Of course, also, we are in the middle of the Hanukkah season now, too, as well, so I should say you might already be celebrating the holiday season as well, right? So, happy holidays to everyone. Coming up in the Science Cafe, though, for the rest of the month, I do want to let everybody know we've got some really exciting topics coming up. Tonight, we're going to be talking about that big E word, at least a little bit. Evolution, right? The thing that drives what makes life on Earth in ways. I think that's what we're going to be learning a little bit about tonight. Next week, for the Science Cafe, though, we've got an expert from Duke University coming who's going to be talking about the Internet of Things. Who's heard of this? The way that every device in your home, from your toaster to your refrigerator, could be connected to the Internet and be spitting out data. We're going to be talking about everything involved with the Internet of Things next week. And then the week between the Christmas and New Year's holiday, that Thursday night, the 28th, you'll definitely want to be here because we're going to have a super fun night. Greg Scoopian and I are going to be on stage for a cafe we're calling Collected Curiosities. We're going to be doing a sort of show and tell with some of the really cool stuff that you can find in this museum's collection. So we've got about a dozen things we're going to pull out from the museum collection to show you. I'm not going to give away any of it yet because I want everyone to come out and see some of the fascinating stuff that this museum has out of its more than 4 million specimens. Some cool stuff is going to happen. So mark your calendars. Make sure you're here for the rest of this month's Science Cafes. Tonight, we have biology professor, author, and the curator at Harvard of the Museum of Comparative Zoology. He's the curator of herpetology there at Harvard. And he's written this book. It's been out, he says, for about 4 months now. Improbable Destinies, Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution. Anybody seen this book yet? Oh, yeah, fabulous. Oh, yeah. Some folks even already picked up their copies tonight, which I will say you can do. We do have a few copies of Dr. Losos' book for sale here in the Science Cafe, and he's right there. So I'm going to go ahead and let him agree to signing your books for you since he's here. No, he said he would do that in advance. I wouldn't do that to him. So make sure you pick up the book. I'm pretty sure you'll find tonight's talk interesting. Improbable Destinies, the Fate, Chance, Future of Evolution. So I have to admit that my understanding of evolution probably is not that detailed. I mean, I've read, I've studied some, and from what I know, evolution is mostly a sort of random process. Things in the environment can point and direct and impact the course of a species' evolution, and so can random mutations in the DNA and genetic code. But then on the flip side, you tend to look at the life around you and say, well, yeah, this is just how things would be any way that it happened, right? But maybe not. So is the path of evolution predictable? That was the tagline that I got for the cafe tonight, and it really sort of boggles my mind, right? Why are things the way they are and not some other way? It's a constant question. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the stage and the microphone over to Dr. Jonathan Losos.
Thank you very much. That was very kind of you. Well, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've never done a science cafe before, and so wish me luck. I understand this is a very informal setting, and please, if you have questions, raise your hand, yell them out, or whatever. Not that informal? Yeah. I have to hold, not that informal. All right. Should I repeat what I said? Did you get the gist of it? All right, I'm going to hope you did. Well, I'm going to start my talk by showing a couple of video clips from a couple of movies. The first movie is one that I am guessing just about everyone here has seen. It was in 2006 voted the most inspirational movie of all time. Anyone guess what it is? It's a Wonderful Life. And I'm sure most of you have seen that. I'm going to show you a clip, the climatic part of the movie. George Bailey, played by Jimmy Stewart, a wonderful man, has come across hard times, and he's contemplating killing himself. And his guardian angel, Clarence Godbody, comes down from heaven to convince him it's a bad idea. Now, one thing you have to remember, George had saved the life of his brother when his brother was 9, just so this clip will make sense. Here we go.
Strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. When he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he?
But where are the houses?
We weren't here to build them. Your brother, Harry Bailey, broke through the ice and was drowned at the age of 9.
That's a lie. Harry Bailey went to war. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor. He saved the lives of every man on that transport.
Every man on that transport died. Harry wasn't there to save them because you weren't there to save Harry. You see, George, you really had a wonderful life. Don't you see what a mistake it would be to throw it away?
So the point of this scene is that what happens in the past affects the world around us today. Change something in the past, and we would have a very different outcome today. Well, that message resonated in many ways, but to one person it had a special significance, and that was the famous evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. And in 1989, he wrote a book whose title paid homage to the movie. The book was called Wonderful Life. And Gould's argument was that our understanding of evolution was the same as the understanding in the movie, that the world we see today is the result of the particular circumstances that happened in the past. And if events had occurred differently in the past, the world and the species that occur today would be very different. And so Gould said he had this idea, a thought experiment he called replaying life's tape. And he said, you press the rewind button and go back to any time and place in the past, then let the tape run again and see if the repetition looks at all like the original. And Gould's conclusion was, in fact, alter any early event and evolution cascades into a radically different channel. The outcome would be very different. And hitting home where it matters most, he concluded, replay the tape of life 1,000,000 times, and I doubt that anything like Homo sapiens would ever evolve again. Well, now I want to go to the second movie clip, and this is a movie that is sadly not nearly as well known. It's the movie The Good Dinosaur. Did anyone here see the movie? No. A couple of people. It was sadly one of Pixar's rare failures. But I think I can admit this here without any shame. I love dinosaurs. And so when I saw that this movie was coming out, I was thrilled, particularly because Pixar has a reputation for consulting with scientists, for hiring scientists to make sure that their movies are completely accurate. For example, I know the scientist who consulted on Finding Nemo, and Pixar really listened to him and changed many things about the movie to get it right. So I was really excited to see how Pixar and their dinosaur experts would portray these great beasts. So let's take a look at the trailer for The Good Dinosaur. That's Parasaurolophus and Brontosaurus, very accurate. I know the answer to that what-if question. If the asteroid hadn't wiped out the dinosaurs, well, they would still be here today, and we would not be. We used to think that dinosaurs were pushed to extinction by our mammalian ancestors, that perhaps our ancestors ate the dinosaur eggs into extinction, or in some other way, thanks to our superior brains and our warm-blooded metabolism, we had ousted the dinosaurs. That's what we used to think, but we now know that that is nonsense. That, in fact, if you look at the history of life, dinosaurs and mammals evolved at the same time, give or take a few million years. And so for the first 200 million years, dinosaurs and mammals coexisted. And dinosaurs were dominant, and mammals were a very minor part of the global ecosystem. So, for example, this is a portrayal of the scene in the Cretaceous, near the end of the age of the dinosaurs. And as you see, the dinosaurs are ruling the world, and the mammals, you can barely see them. In fact, can you pick out the mammal here? There it is, right there. And so that's an idea of the role that mammals were playing. And so if that asteroid had not hit, there is really no reason to believe that the dinosaurs would not continue, would have kept continuing to rule the world, and we would have been in the underbrush like a little opossum or rat. So I was very excited about this movie. We were going to see what a world today would look like with the dinosaurs still ruling. So let's go back to the trailer. Parasaurolophus, Brontosaurus. That's Pteranodon, a flying reptile. Wait a minute. That doesn't look like Triceratops. That kind of looks like a mammal. That's unexpected. And what is that? Could it be? Yes. There's a baby human with the dinosaurs. I was flummoxed. How could a dinosaur expert have allowed this in a movie? I was very surprised. And the question that arises, who was this dinosaur expert who put this? Are there any scientists who actually believe that if dinosaurs had not gone extinct, that humans would still have evolved? Well, it turns out there are. This is Simon Conway Morris. He's one of the world's most famous paleontologists. He's at the University of Cambridge in England. And here's what he has to say. Without the end Cretaceous asteroid impact, the rise of a hominid-like form would have been postponed, not canceled. The appearance of the hominids would have been delayed by approximately 30 million years. And here's his argument. About 30 million years ago, the world got a lot cooler, and polar caps formed, and temperate regions became cool. Now, as you know, dinosaurs are reptiles. They're warm-blooded. As a result, they may have been restricted to the equatorial regions, and that thus would have allowed mammals to diversify in more temperate regions. And so Conway Morris argues mammals would have evolved just 30 million years later. And not only would they have evolved, but they would have evolved in the same way, producing rhinoceroses and woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats and horses, all the same things that evolved today, including hominids. And so that is the argument that even with the dinosaurs around, humans still would have evolved. That's one argument. But it turns out there's a second argument as well, a scenario in which we could still have humans even if the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct. And to understand that, that we could still have human-like forms. And to understand that argument, we need to go from the good dinosaur to the bad dinosaur. Everyone now knows Velociraptor, the villain of the Jurassic Park movies, and oddly enough, the hero of Jurassic World. But take a close look at Velociraptor. Here's an animal that walks on two legs, has forward-facing eyes, has grasping hands. You remember it turning that doorknob in the scene in Jurassic Park? And it's a pretty smart animal. Remember, it outsmarts the safari hunter. Well, put those together, bipedal, grasping hands, intelligent, maybe sound a little bit familiar? Well, Velociraptor had a close relative named Troodon that lived at the very end of the Cretaceous period. And Troodon had the distinction of having the largest brain for its body size of any dinosaur. About 35 years ago, a Canadian paleontologist named Dale Russell wrote a scientific monograph on Troodon. And I should say Dale Russell is now at North Carolina State University, as far as I'm aware. That's where does anyone know him? I actually tried to contact him, but he is still here. Aha. Well, all right. So this was some of his work 35 years ago. He wrote this classic scientific monograph describing every bone of Troodon in exquisite detail. But then at the end of the paper, he did something unusual. He noted that Troodon had the largest brain of any dinosaur, and he argued that natural selection has always favored larger brain size for more intelligent animals. And so he asked, suppose the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct and natural selection had continued to favor large brain size in dinosaurs, how might Troodon have evolved? And remember, he knows the anatomy of Troodon very well. And so here is his argument. The natural selection is favoring bigger brains, so the brain gets bigger. Well, then the face would shorten because big-brained animals tend not to have long muzzles. Why that is, we don't know, but that's apparently true. More importantly, the neck would get shorter because if you have a big bowling ball-sized head, you don't want to have a floppy neck. So you get a shorter neck to hold the head on. In addition, the animal would then evolve an upright posture because with a big head, it's easier to maintain your balance if it's right over your center of gravity. So it would become much more erect. In turn, that means that the tail would no longer be needed as a counterbalance, so the tail would be lost. And then a few technical changes to the foot and ankle structure, and voila, the Dinosauroid, a hominid-like reptile. He actually even commissioned a statue, shown here, of what this would have looked like. Now remember, Russell was not asking, how could you evolve a dinosaur into a human? He was asking, what would have happened if evolution favored large brains? And the result of his speculation was that it would have produced an animal very similar to us, a highly intelligent animal, almost indistinguishable except in its scaly reptilian way. So before I go on, any questions about the Dinosauroid and how this came to be? All right, well, yeah, yes. The question is, were dinosaurs thought to be cold-blooded? Well, there's a lot of debate about this, and it goes back and forth. A lot of people seem to think that in one way or the other, dinosaurs had high body temperatures. So, but there's still a lot of debate about it. So very likely they were, especially the very big ones. Other questions? Well, as I said, if you have questions, just let me know. All right, this idea may sound to you a little crazy, but it turns out it's taken seriously, at least in some quarters. Here, for example, are 3 publications that are very positively commenting on this idea. In fact, one of them was a book by E.O. Wilson. So the idea is taken seriously, at least by some. So much so, here's a BBC documentary from about 10 years ago.
Some scientists consider a world in which we may have rubbed shoulders with a dinosaur equivalent as highly plausible. Evolutionary paleobiologist Simon Conway Morris is among a select group of people who argue that evolution is far from random, believing that life, given time, will evolve via natural selection toward a few optimum designs, and they don't come much better than the human form.
So keep in mind that idea, optimal designs. We'll come back to that in a moment. Well, this idea of the evolutionary inevitability of human-like organisms has attracted renewed attention in recent years with the discovery that there are many, many planets even in our galaxy that are very similar to Earth. We used to think that Earth was unique, but we now know that there may be millions, even billions of Earth-like planets just in our galaxy. And many people now believe that with that many planets, the evolution of life probably is very likely, and even possibly the evolution of intelligent life. And so the question is, if intelligent life has evolved on other planets, what will it look like? Will it look at all like us? Well, I think the first place to consult for a question like that is Hollywood. And their answer is pretty clear. intelligent life on other planets will be very human-like. Maybe the ears will be pointy, or an insect head, or maybe a little raccoony, but basically it'll be a hominid form, big head, 2 eyes, bipedal, 2 arms, and so on. And in fact, if you look at the other creatures that these science fiction movies postulate on these worlds, they too look very familiar to Earth-like forms, slight variations, but clearly the idea is that life on other planets will look a lot like us. Well, again, there is scientific support for this view. For example, George McGee, a biologist at Rutgers University, says, if any large, fast-swimming organisms exist in the ocean of Jupiter's moon Europa, I predict with confidence that they will have streamlined bodies, very similar to a porpoise or a shark. And the environmental biologist Robert Beery concurs, saying that if we find intelligent beings in space, in all probability, they will look an awful lot like us. And finally, Simon Conway Morris again, saying, certainly it's not the case that every Earth-like planet will have life, let alone humanoids, but if you want a sophisticated plant, it will look awfully like a flower. And if you want to fly, there's only a few ways you can do that. If you want to swim like a shark, there's only a few ways you can do that. And so the idea is that forms on other Earth-like planets will end up looking a lot like life has evolved here on Earth. So I want just a quick question. What do you think the basis is for these scientists making these claims? Any ideas how they come to this idea? Yes.
Adaptation, if you will, that is in similar end products.
That's exactly it. He said the idea that similar environments will lead to the evolution of similar features. And in fact, it's a phenomenon called, here on Earth, called convergent evolution. And convergent evolution refers to cases in which species evolve to be similar. And in fact, you're familiar with some examples of convergent evolution. For example, fast-swimming marine predators all have very much the same body form, a torpedo-shaped streamlined body with a dorsal fin, two flippers in front, and a powerful tail. And many different types of animals, as shown here, have independently evolved this body form to occupy this ecological niche. Here's the definition of convergent evolution. Other examples, we're all familiar with the hummingbird with its long curved beak to reach into flowers, but very similar bill anatomy has evolved in other birds around the world that feast on nectar. Or in Australia, this animal looks very much like a wolf, but it's not a wolf. It's a relative of the kangaroo, a marsupial, but it has evolved to be very similar to the wolf. Or in deserts around the world, two-legged hopping rodents have evolved many different times. And in the plant world, in the new world, here we have cactus. In the old world, a very different type of plant has evolved to be similar. This is the phenomenon of convergent evolution, species evolving the same adaptations to similar environmental features. Well, I want to give you one more example of convergent evolution because it's one of my favorites. This woman here is a friend of mine, Louise Roth, in the biology department at Duke University. Louise is a normal-sized woman. And I point that out because here she is kneeling down, and she is still taller than these elephants. That's an adult male elephant to her left. This elephant occurred on the island of Malta until fairly recently. And in fact, there are miniature elephants that used to occur, they're all extinct now, on islands around the world. For example, in the Channel Islands, the oxymoronic dwarf mammoth evolved. That's a normal-sized mammoth in the background and the Channel Island one in front of it. And in fact, these puny pachyderms, as I call them, evolved at least 6 times in different islands around the world. So repeatedly, you put in an elephant on a small island, it evolves small body size. Now, I do want to digress for just one moment. You may have heard recently there's been some thought of trying to clone the woolly mammoth, to try to recreate it by taking frozen tissues from Siberia and coming up with a mammoth. Maybe that could work, it probably wouldn't, but I think they don't quite have the right idea. We don't really want to clone a mammoth. We want to clone a pygmy mammoth. Can you imagine what a great house pet this would be? But that aside, I think people are probably familiar with the examples of convergent evolution I just illustrated, but what is news, and this is a recent development in evolutionary biology, is the idea that convergent evolution is all around us. It is much more ubiquitous than we used to think. And in fact, there have been a number of books in the last 15 years that have been just catalogs of one example of convergent evolution after another. Two of these books, each one of them by Conway Morris, is this thick. And so the argument that these authors make is that evolutionary convergence is completely ubiquitous. Wherever you look, you see it. And Conway Morris goes on to argue, rerun the tape of life as often as you like, and the end result will be much the same. What he is saying is this. He is basically arguing that the environment poses the same challenges to organisms time and time again, that species around the world and through time have faced the same environmental challenges, and that they have evolved the same optimal solutions. There are best ways of adapting to ecological niches, and so these adaptations evolve time and time again convergently. So much so that Conway Morris argues that the outcome we see in the world today almost has to occur. And the implication is that the evolution of human-like forms is inevitable, and that if life occurred on another Earth-like planet, very similar life forms would evolve there. Now, why is this argument being made now, or why do we now realize that convergent evolution is so common? It's the result of our better understanding of the evolutionary tree of life. As we've been able to sequence genomes of so many organisms, we're discovering the true evolutionary relationships of species and finding out that many species that we thought were closely related because they're anatomically similar actually are not closely related, that their similarity is the result of convergent evolution. So that is the argument for the inevitability of humans. Undoubtedly, this is the argument that Pixar had in mind when they created their movie with the baby human on top of the brontosaurus. Any questions before I move on about convergent evolution or Pixar or dinosaurs? Yes, back there.
I think I remember very unclearly hearing about a way that you can see a trait and the amount of different times it has evolved in different species. Like you can say this trait has evolved 3 times in the past. Is that a real thing that I remember?
Well, yes, we can see that in 2 ways. One is by looking at the fossil record. When we see fossils like I showed you with the fast marine swimmers, one of those was an ichthyosaurus, a reptile from the age of dinosaurs that looked really almost indistinguishable from a dolphin. And yet we know those species are not closely related, and so we know that those are independent evolutions of that body form. So the fossil record shows us many examples, and you could count them up, and that these books do count them up. Or you can look at present-day species, and by building their evolutionary tree, you can see, well, there are species that are very similar, but they're not closely related, so they must have independently evolved their similarity. And so in that way, you can count up how many times a particular adaptation evolves. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Hold on. Good morning. Susan, really neat. And positioning of bodies and stuff like that. Would the same theory that you're talking about apply to internal systems, warm-bloodedness and the way waste is processed and that sort of thing?
So the question is, I've been talking about external features of anatomy, and does the same argument apply for internal things, internal features like warm-bloodedness or other aspects of physiology? And the answer is absolutely yes. For example, we know warm-bloodedness has evolved many times, not only in mammals and in birds and in bumblebees and in some other organisms as well. So yes, the same argument applies for other types of features as well.
You mentioned that you know we're looking at similar environments are going to produce similar creatures and so forth. Now, what happens in the case of man that's now modifying his own environment then? If you have a creature that modifies the environment, you no longer have the same progression environment to live in.
So yes, I mean we are changing the world in many ways, and that should change the evolutionary course of events. And so you're right. But the question would be, well, if on another planet human type things evolved, would they modify the environment in the same way? I think that's a very interesting point to talk about. And digressing just a moment, I think another interesting aspect, we're changing the environment in some predictable ways. For example, people are now just studying how species are adapting to living in cities. I mean, cities are very, in many cases, different environments, and they're replicated. You can go from one city to the next and see are squirrels or raccoons evolving in the same way. And people are just starting to study that question, but be fascinating to find out. Yes?
Yes. Simon Conway Morris seems to have an agenda that he's funded by the Templeton Foundation and other groups that are his agenda seems to be more about trying to support the idea that there is something behind evolution, and that's why we have the convergence, and that's why you mentioned that it ultimately leads to bigger brain things. We don't know that. We don't know that that's true. But also, we're also starting from the same basic body plans on this planet. So it's not surprising that we see so much convergent evolution on our planet, and it probably would happen on other planets too. But to assume that anything is going to come out humanoid on another planet where the initial body plans may be totally different than they began on this planet, would be the chances of that happening. If we go back far enough in the evolutionary history, the chances of getting humanoids on other planets goes down probably a lot. It's still back to chance.
So let me respond to two things. First, your point that on Earth we're starting in the same body plan, that it predisposes us to evolve in the same way. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. The first point about Simon Conway Morris having an agenda. Simon Conway Morris is a very respected paleontologist. He's also a very devout Catholic, I believe. There are those who have criticized, they have claimed that his arguments are religiously inspired. I'm not sure that, I've read his papers very carefully, and if they are religiously inspired, he's done a very good job of hiding it with regard to the evidence on convergent evolution. I've read a lot of them, particularly the ones on convergent evolution. I chose in my book to ignore that because I'm taking him just on his science, and he has done a very good job of documenting the ubiquity of convergent evolution. And so I decided whatever his motives are, I think he makes the case that he's made. And I will point out other people in his camp, such as George McGee, the other author, as far as I know, don't have that religious leaning. But in any case, let me move on from that. All right, so Simon Conway Morris and others argue convergence is ubiquitous, it's the rule, and as a result, the evolutionary outcomes are very predictable and inevitable. But there's another side to the argument, and the other side of that argument is that perhaps they've taken their argument a little too far, because not everything in the world around us is the result of convergent evolution. In fact, there are many species that have not converged, and I want to give you a few examples of those. And so we'll start on the island continent of Australia. And the animal that perhaps you associate with Australia is the kangaroo. The kangaroo is the dominant herbivore in Australia. It is the equivalent of deer here in North Carolina, and yet the kangaroos don't look at all like deer. And in fact, nothing like a kangaroo has evolved anywhere else in the world. Or the koala. The koala is a unique life form in Australia with no parallels anywhere else in the world. Or, prepare yourself for the world's greatest animal ever, the duck-billed platypus. Clearly, el numero uno animal. it gets a really bad rap. People think it's a ridiculous animal, a mishmash of parts. It's actually exquisitely adapted to the streams in which it evolved. And I would be happy to tell you why platypuses are so great later. But suffice to say that platypuses live in streams like those that occur all around the world, like that occur in the Neuse River here. If convergent evolution was so ubiquitous, we would have a platypus paddling right down the Neuse River. But in fact, there is nothing like the platypus anywhere else. Or we can go next door to Australia, over to New Zealand, an island in which there are no native land mammals. And in the absence of mammals, other animals have evolved to fill the same ecological niches. This is a kiwi. A kiwi has been called an honorary mammal. It lives a mammalian lifestyle. Its wings are reduced to little nubbins. It can't fly. Its feathers are reduced, and they basically are hair. They're fluffy, downy hair. They certainly don't serve any flying purpose. Kiwis have a great sense of smell, unlike most birds, and they walk around on the ground, rooting in the underbrush, trying to dig up earthworms and other things, maybe like a hedgehog or a badger. But they don't look anything like that. They have evolved a different appearance that is not paralleled anywhere else. And in fact, New Zealand is full of all kinds of oddities. There are flightless parrots that also walk around on the ground, and they actually walk up trees to get the nuts in the palm trees. The largest carnivore, or one of the larger carnivores, is the kea. This is another parrot that has been known to attack sheep. It lands on their back and basically gouges their skin. There are enormous crickets, snails the size of hamburgers, plants whose leaves grow on the inside and the branches on the outside. And my favorite, the bats, a type of bat that forages by landing on the ground and walking around in the underbrush catching insects. So New Zealand, a separate theater of evolution, has full of oddities unparalleled anywhere else. And so, in fact, there are many examples of lack of convergence, of species that have evolved adaptations for where they live that have never been paralleled anywhere else in the world. And we might ask why that is the case, and in fact I can talk about this for quite a while, but I just want to give you one example of why convergent evolution might not occur. And it's a subject that I think is near and dear to the heart of many of you, and that is lemurs. Lemurs from Madagascar. But before getting to lemurs, I want to talk about woodpeckers. Now, everyone knows what a woodpecker is, but you may not know what it's doing when it's going around going rat-a-tat-tat on your trees. So let me tell you. What a woodpecker is doing is it's tapping on dead wood, listening for a hollow echo, because what that indicates is there is a tunnel of a wood-eating grub that it would like to eat. And so it goes tap, 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 and when it hears an echo, it then goes tap, 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 tap really hard, using its bill as a jackhammer till it gets to the to the tunnel in the wood. Once it does that, it sticks out its long tongue covered with bristles. In fact, its tongue is so long that it wraps around its head. But it sticks its tongue out, and it grabs the grub with the little prickles on the tongue and pulls them in. And that's how woodpeckers get their food. So that's the woodpecker way of life. Now, back to lemurs. You guys no doubt are familiar with the eye, the bizarre-looking nocturnal lemur of Madagascar. And you probably know how it lives. It's got this elongate little finger. And anyway, here's what, basically the short story, the eye lives the woodpecker lifestyle. It does the exact same thing, but with different tools.
To find its prey, it uses a multi-purpose digit. Sharp incisors rip away the bark. Its bony middle finger changes roles from a scanner to a scraper. The eye locks in. The finger transforms into a hook. A sharp fingernail impales the grub. It's dragged up, out, and into the eye's mouth.
A face that only a mother could love. But they're doing the same thing as the woodpecker. Tap, 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 listening for the hollow, digging with their teeth, and extracting with their finger. But they've evolved very different features to do the same tasks. Well, why has this happened? Why haven't they evolved convergently? Well, the answer is that birds and monkeys are very different. Birds don't have any fingers. They don't have any teeth. So it would have been very difficult for them to evolve the features that the ii has. Conversely, the ii doesn't have a long bill, but it does have teeth. And so it shows that their evolutionary histories predispose them to adapt in different ways. And in fact, that is the message we get from looking at many of these case studies, that distantly related species, this gets back to the question that was brought up earlier, distantly related species are more likely, because of their acquired evolutionary differences, to find different adaptations to the same problem. Whereas closely related species, because they are very similar, are much more likely to converge. And so although convergent evolution is very common, lack of convergence is also common. Well, at this point, I think what we've found is the sort of unsatisfying but true example that both convergence and non-convergence do occur. And the task of scientists now is to try to figure out how and why it occurs in particular cases. Now, before I go on, I'm going to move on from convergent evolution, but are there questions or thoughts about that? All right, well, you may find this to be somewhat unsatisfying in a way that this is how science is done. We make a long list and another long list and see which list is longer. This is not your picture of the standard scientific process, which is supposed to be based on experiments and the laboratory techniques you learned in school. And well, let me now digress to a different point and go to Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin was an experimentalist, a great experimentalist. He experimented on all kinds of ideas, but it never occurred to him to do an experiment on the idea of natural selection. And the reason is simple. Darwin thought that evolution occurred glacially slowly, much too slowly to be able to be observed over a human lifetime or even over centuries. And so it never occurred to Darwin to do experiments. Now, I have been criticized for saying the following, but I'm going to say it anyway. Darwin was wrong. He was wrong specifically about the pace of evolution. He was right about a lot of things. His theory of the evolution of by natural selection, absolutely correct, as many of his other ideas. But he was mistaken about the pace of evolution. And in fact, we now know that when environmental conditions change, natural selection can be strong and evolution can occur extremely rapidly. There's the famous case of the peppered moth that got dark when the air was polluted. There's the evolution of resistance to pesticides and herbicides by many plants and animals around us. And of course, resistance by microbes to our antibiotics. So we now know that evolution can occur very rapidly. A corollary of this is that we can actually do experiments on evolution. We can actually alter conditions experimentally and expect that we might see an evolutionary outcome very quickly. And that means more specifically that we can ask the question, do species or do populations adapt in the same way? We can subject multiple populations to the same conditions and look at their evolutionary response. And in fact, people are doing just this kind of experiment. This is an animal that you're probably familiar with, the guppy, colorful guppies. You may not know where guppies come from. They come from the streams of Trinidad. Moreover, you also may not know that not all guppies are colorful. Some guppies are quite drab. And it turns out that the drab ones occur low down in mountain streams, at low elevations, in places where there are larger predatory fishes. Whereas higher up in the mountains, where the predatory fishes don't occur, the guppies are much more colorful. So this correlation has suggested that predation by the bigger fish prevents the guppies from being very colorful. Well, a scientist decided to do an experiment to actually test that idea. And so he got some drab guppies from a pool where the predators existed, and he simply moved them to higher pools where there were no predators. And sure enough, within very short time, just a couple of years, they evolved to be very colorful. And in fact, this has happened multiple times. So you can make a prediction and you can test it in nature evolutionarily and see that the result is very predictable. I myself have done experiments like this with the lizards I study, lizards in the genus Anolis. Now you may know the green anole lizard that occurs around here. Well, there are many species of anoles, and they live in different environments. And one generality is that species that live on broad surfaces, like tree trunks, have long legs, whereas those that use very narrow surfaces, like twigs, have short legs. This correlation suggests that there's a causal relationship. Maybe using narrow surfaces prompts the evolution of short legs. Well, we can test that by making a long-legged lizard use narrow surfaces. And so to do that, we took lizards that lived in a forest in the background and put them on tiny islands in the Bahamas, where they had to use narrow shrubs. The prediction was straightforward, that they would evolve shorter legs, and in fact they all did. Over the period of three years, we see all 7 populations evolving to have shorter legs. So these sorts of experiments are allowing us to actually test the idea, how predictable, how repeatable is evolution. Now, it's very early days for these sort of field evolution experiments, but there's a lot of work now that is audacious in its scope. For example, in the sand hills of Nebraska, researchers at McGill University have established enormous cages in which they put deer mice, and the cages have different soils, and their prediction is that they will evolve to match the color, their fur will evolve to match the color of the soil, dark or light. Sure enough, over a period of about 5 years, they have evolved the differences in color. Or on the campus of the University of British Columbia, these enormous swimming pool-sized artificial ponds have created. They've been set up very naturally as very natural ecosystems, and they've dropped this fish, the 3-spined stickleback, into these pools. And in half the pools, they put in a predatory fish, a trout, and their prediction is that in those pools, they will evolve larger spines. And sure enough, again, after just a couple of years, larger spine size has evolved. So it's a very exciting time, early days, but an exciting time for these field evolution experiments. However, people have been doing studies like this in the lab for a bit longer to test the same idea. I just want to give you one example of these studies. This is the grandfather of all these studies, if you will. It was set up by Michigan State biologist Rich Lenski almost 30 years ago, where he took E. coli in a petri dish. Now, we all know E. coli, it can cause food poisoning and so on. He used a harmless strain, and he took one petri dish, and he inoculated 12 different flasks from this one dish. So they were all initially genetically identical. And all 12 flasks had the same nutrients for the E. coli to eat. And it was a diet that they were not well adapted to, an unusual diet. And his question was, would they adapt to this new diet? And if so, would they adapt in the same way? Well, he's followed these 12 flasks for 30 years. And what he found was that for the first 15 years, they all adapted in pretty much the same way, indicating that evolution was quite predictable. But then in 2004, the population in one flask discovered a new way to get food out of their nutrient broth, a way that allowed them to grow to a population size 10 times larger than any of the other populations. And to this day, the other 11 populations still have not found that adaptation. And so it does illustrate that evolution is not completely predictable. Even initially identical populations will diverge, and some will find different ways of adapting to their new situation. Well, this research by Lenski has created its own subdiscipline of evolutionary biology, with people doing ever more elaborate studies of this sort, indicating that evolution is predictable to some extent, but not always. Summarizing these studies very quickly or very briefly, the conclusions seem to be the same, both from experimental evolution and from looking at convergent evolution in nature. And the idea is that closely related species or populations tend to adapt in the same way, whereas more distantly related populations often find different adaptations. And so that is the message of what we're seeming to find, that evolution can be predictable sometimes, but not others. Well, let's return to the dinosauroid briefly to wrap up here. Is this idea actually reasonable? If the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct, would they have evolved to look like us? Well, we now know one thing that Dale Russell did not know 35 years ago, and that is that dinosaurs were covered with feathers. Many of them were, especially the theropod dinosaurs, such as Troodon. So you need to remake your image. If nothing else, it's not a scaly reptilian hominid, but at least cloak that hominid in feathers. But more importantly, is this idea reasonable? Think about the evolution of humans. Here's our ape-like ancestor walking in the trees, and if evolution favors it evolving a larger brain and also using its hands, well, it makes sense that hominids would evolve to become have an erect body posture because we had no tail to balance that larger head. And so if we hadn't evolved to stand up straight, we would always be pitching forward. We couldn't have become bipedal. And so there was no other option. And that's because our ancestors had lost their tails 20 million years before this all happened. By contrast, Troodon was already bipedal. It already had a tail, was already bipedal, and used its tail to balance its front end of the body. If its head got larger, do we really think it would have completely reorganized its body structure in order to stand up straight? It seems unlikely. Consider, for example, T-Rex, which had an enormous head, not because it had a big brain, it just had a lot of teeth. Did it stand up bipedally or erect? No, it just evolved a larger tail. And so this is an example of the evolutionary history of a trait, of a lineage affecting the way that evolution would occur. It seems much more likely that Troodon or any dinosaur with a bigger brain just would have evolved a larger tail. Well, when I was writing this book, I knew about the dinosauroid idea, and I thought it had been forgotten. I thought, in my book, I'm going to bring this idea back to light, and it'll be fun to talk about. And then one day, as I was writing, I thought, maybe I ought to Google it. And so I typed in dinosauroid, and you can guess where I'm getting to. It turns out there's a whole little sub-niche in cyberspace devoted to speculation about the dinosauroid. And suffice to say that Russell's idea has not fared well. In fact, most people out there think that an intelligent, large-bodied dinosauroid would look kind of like this, a big, feathery, chicken-like thing. Or maybe like this, or like this, or this is my version from my book. And so the idea is these were already bipedal feathered animals. They would have just gone with that and evolved bigger brains. So, lastly, what about life on other planets? Would we see forms like this? Well, we don't need to go to other planets to think about life in evolutionary theaters. We've already seen life on Australia and New Zealand, not at all like life anywhere else. And think about the age of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were very diverse. They went extinct. Did life recapitulate the dinosaurian form? No, we're very different. There's really no reason to expect that life on other planets, based on very different processes, probably not DNA or anything like it, would look anything like life here. I think there are a few movies that get things much more correct in the idea that life on other planets, should it exist, will be truly alien, very different from life here. I think last year's movie Arrival was great in that way, postulating life forms completely unfamiliar to anything we have today. But let's return to Earth. Are we the inevitable outcome of the evolutionary process? Not at all. The asteroid is an obvious example, but who knows what other events in life's history, had they occurred differently, would have led evolution down a different course. We were not destined, we were just lucky. We can thank our lucky stars or our lucky asteroids for being here today, and so we should make the best of our evolutionary good fortune. So, thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer more questions.
Let's give him a round of applause. All right. Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes still left for Q&A. I've got a mic. Katie's going to have a mic. There she is. We'll bring the microphone to you, so throw your hand up if you have a question. That way we can see you, and we'll try to get to as many folks as we can in the time we have left.
Hey, you were talking about your lizards with their short legs. You said it took 3 years for that graph. How many generations is 3 years?
Well, female lizards of this type can breed at 3 or 4 months of age, but they don't breed during the winter. So 3 years is about maximally, maybe 6 generations under maximal conditions. I should point out those legs are shorter, but they're not substantially shorter.
It's still measurable, though,
yes,
right?
Yes, right. But if I held in my hands, you wouldn't say, my God, that's a much shorter leg. But it is certainly detectable.
All right.
So on the subject of the quick evolution, when the environment changes dramatically, some of us have read in the lay literature about epigenetics, and which might explain this phenomenon without changes in the underlying DNA, just in the expression of that DNA. Do you have a thought about the relevance of epigenetics, which you might explain better, to the phenomenon of quick adaptation?
So this is a complicated topic, but epigenetics is basically the idea that that genes can be modified in an individual so that they work differently, and those modifications can get passed on to the next generation. Now, we used to think that this was impossible, but we're beginning to realize that it does occur. That suggests the possibility that if a gene is modified and that modification gets passed on to the next generation and that modification is beneficial, that it actually sounds like Lamarckian evolution, which we thought we had disproven 150 years ago. The evidence to date is not that convincing. It does occur, but we don't know. These changes do get passed on to the next generation, but it's unclear how long they get passed on. And so it's an interesting idea, and some people are hyping it as we need to rethink everything we know about evolution. The data today we don't have the data to understand. But it's very exciting in an area of active research, and we'll just have to see what it leads to.
Hi, do we know why genetically identified, genetically identical species can diverge after a while in behavior, or is that merely statistical?
Why do genetically identical populations diverge?
Yes.
If they're in the same conditions?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they're in the same conditions and those conditions haven't changed, so they're already adapted to that condition. One possibility is just the randomness of mutations, that even if you start off with two populations that are identical, like those E. coli, well, mutations occur. And sometimes just by chance, a mutation will become established in one population or not another. And in fact, if those two populations are identical but are facing new conditions to which they are not well adapted, the way in which they adapt will be a function of what mutations occur. And so if one mutation occurs in one population and a different mutation in another one, that they will then adapt in different ways, because you can only evolve by the mutations that exist in a population. Does that answer your question?
This question's off topic, so feel free not to answer it, but I was wondering, can you describe what you're doing in your new position with WashU and how it ties into your prior work, or to the degree that it does?
Well, yes. I'm currently a professor at Harvard University, but next month I'm moving to Washington University in St. Louis, where I am going to be the founding director of a new biodiversity center that is a partnership between Washington University, the St. Louis Zoo, and the Missouri Botanical Garden. And so we're trying to bring together these three institutions to work together to understand and conserve biodiversity. So it's an extension in a new direction of the sort of things I do.
Hi. I know that you talked a lot about convergent evolution, but there's two other types of evolution too, right?
What are you thinking of?
Divergent, I can't remember the other.
Stabilizing?
Probably.
Well, divergent evolution is when species adapt in different ways, or they diverge in how they are. And stabilize, I'm not sure what the third one would be necessarily. I mean, often populations will stay the same, a phenomenon called stasis. One common reason is that they are in an environment that favors that form, and so they don't diverge because they're already very well adapted.
Sorry, I just vaguely remember having to learn 3 specific types.
I think you're talking about the 3 types of natural selection, which are directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. Directional is, say, when bigger body size is favored. Stabilizing is when you stay the same because you're already well adapted. Disruptive is when a population is favored to be both small and large, and so it can lead to different types within that population.
Okay.
So I think I've got time for one more. So if you have a question and I haven't seen you, raise your hand. That way I can get a mic to you. Okay, there we go. There's always one more question.
Always one more.
But this is probably not a great last question, but so do you think the principles of convergent evolution can be applied to other systems? For example, forms of government or things like that? I mean, especially since we're in a period now where what's happening around us politically is different and shocking and surprising. Do the responses of groups of people to the way they manage the social system behave in the same way that evolution does in biological systems?
Well, people draw parallels in many other aspects of life to what occurs in evolution. And sometimes I find those parallels to be pretty forced because, of course, evolution by natural selection has a very particular set of requirements, particularly about DNA-based genetic inheritance. And so it's often not clear that the analogies really stand up to close scrutiny. On the other hand, it turns out that Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life, where he argued for the importance of what he called contingency, the unexpected or unpredictable events in the past having long-lasting effects on what occurs in the future. That book was not only incredibly influential to evolutionary biologists, but to historians and in many other fields. This idea of contingency that being important was really taken across many different disciplines. And I think that sort of idea is very sensible and should apply to any historical phenomenon. So I think it's a mixed bag, that comparisons to the evolution of anything we talk about, we see it as the evolution of style, the evolution of governments. It's not necessarily, to my mind, clear that they need to operate by the same rules as biological evolution.
Let's give him one more round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you very much. All right. Well, now you've all got lots of brain nuggets to take home and think about, don't you? You know what would be the perfect way to continue the discussion? Buy his book. Right. If you do want to pick up a copy of an Improbable Destinies, you can get that from us right over here on the side. Katie and Roy are setting up where we can sell you books, and I think we can take just about any form of payment except IOUs and bartering. So make sure you go see them if you want to pick up a copy of the book. Dr. Losos will be there too if you want him to sign it. If you don't, you can just leave, but I would get it signed if I were you. Have a great evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out to the Science Cafe. I hope we'll see you next week for the Internet of Things. Travel safe. Bye, everybody.